Emily clutched the straps of her backpack tightly as she walked alongside her father, James. The sharp smell of alcohol lingered in the air, mixing with a heavy silence between them. Her small frame seemed to shrink under the weight of his frustration, his muttered complaints growing louder with every step toward the bus stop. She kept her head down, wishing she could disappear, knowing better than to say a word when he was in this mood. As the bus doors hissed open, James impatiently ushered Emily inside. They found seats near the back, but the tension followed them like a dark cloud. Emily pressed herself against the window, her heart sinking as her father's angry grumbling turned into sharp, slurred words. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, some stealing glances, others pretending not to notice. But one man, seated just behind them, did notice, and he wasn't the kind to look away. Andrew Hayes, a retired Navy SEAL with eyes that missed nothing, observed the scene with quiet intensity. He saw Emily's hunched shoulders, her white-knuckled grip on her bag, and James's escalating tone. Years of training had taught Andrew when to step in, and now was one of those moments. "Sir, that's enough." Andrew's calm yet commanding voice cut through the noise. The entire bus seemed to freeze. James turned, his bloodshot eyes blazing. "Who do you think you are?" The confrontation was far from over, but Emily's heart raced. Was this the moment someone finally stood up for her? James's glare burned as he sized up the man who had dared to speak. His voice was rough, slurred by alcohol, and full of defiance. "You don't know me." "Mind your own business," he snapped, his words laced with frustration and embarrassment. The bus had gone deathly silent, every passenger holding their breath. Emily felt frozen in her seat, her cheeks burning with shame. She wanted to disappear, to make herself invisible, but something in the stranger's calm, unwavering tone stopped her from sinking completely into despair. "I may not know you," Andrew replied, his voice steady but firm, "but I know she deserves better than this." He glanced briefly at Emily, his expression softening just for a moment. "Kids don't need perfection. They need love. And what you're doing right now, it's not love." James's face twisted in anger, but his posture wavered. The alcohol had dulled his sharpness, and Andrew's words seemed to strike a nerve he couldn't completely ignore. "You think you're some kind of hero?" James spat, his voice faltering slightly. "I'm just someone who cares," Andrew said, taking a small step closer. "Enough to tell you to stop before this goes too far." Emily felt the weight of every second that passed. Her father's anger was like a storm building, his face flushed, his hands trembling slightly. She'd seen him like this before, but never with someone standing up to him. Andrew remained steady, his presence calm but commanding. It was the kind of strength that didn't rely on words or threats. It just existed, like an immovable wall. "I don't need a lecture from some stranger," James barked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "You have no idea what I've been through." His words were louder now, echoing in the confined space of the bus. Emily winced, her fingers digging into her backpack straps. Every word felt like a blow, not just to her father's pride, but to her fragile sense of hope. Andrew didn't react to the outburst. Instead, he spoke calmly, his voice cutting through James's anger like a blade. "You're right. I don't know what you've been through. But I see what she's going through," he said, nodding toward Emily. "And it's not right." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Passengers began to shift in their seats, their discomfort growing. Some glanced at Emily with sympathy, others at James with disapproval, but no one else spoke. The driver glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Emily's pulse raced. She knew her father wasn't the type to back down easily. What if this stranger's intervention only made things worse? What if no one could stop what was coming? James's voice grew louder, his words slurring as frustration boiled over. "You think you're some kind of savior, huh? Coming in here, acting like you're better than me." His hands clenched into fists, his face flushed with a mix of anger and shame. The tension on the bus was suffocating, the hum of the engine the only other sound. Emily sat frozen, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She kept her eyes on her lap, terrified of what her father might do next. Andrew didn't back down, his expression calm but unyielding. "This isn't about me," he said firmly. "It's about her. Look at her." He gestured toward Emily, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "She's scared. Do you want to be the reason she feels like this? Or do you want to be better?" For a moment James faltered, his eyes flicking to Emily. She dared to glance up, her wide, tear-filled eyes meeting his. But the vulnerability in her gaze seemed to ignite something darker in him. He shook his head and sneered, the haze of alcohol clouding whatever moment of clarity had started to form. "You don't get it," James snapped, his voice cracking. "No one does. You don't know what it's like to lose everything." The bus came to an abrupt stop, jolting everyone. The driver's voice called out nervously, "Let's keep it calm back there." But the storm brewing inside James showed no signs of calming. Every muscle in Emily's body tensed. What was going to happen now? The bus doors hissed open as the driver threw a cautious glance toward the back. "You need to take it outside if this keeps up," he warned, his voice shaky but firm. James scoffed loudly, slumping back into his seat for a moment. Emily's heart sank. She knew this wasn't over. Her father never let things go. Not like this. Andrew stood his ground, his sharp gaze locked on James. "You think this is about losing everything?" he asked, his tone unwavering. "I've seen people lose everything and still choose to do better. It's not easy, but it's possible." The weight of his words hung in the air, but James laughed bitterly, brushing him off. Then something shifted. Emily noticed the slight tremble in her father's hands, the way his jaw tightened as if holding back more than just anger. "You don't understand," James muttered, his voice barely audible, almost to himself. "You don't know what it's like. To feel like nothing you do is enough." Andrew's expression softened, but before he could respond, James suddenly stood, his movements unsteady but filled with a renewed edge of defiance. "You want to play hero? Fine," he barked, stepping closer to Andrew. Emily gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she clutched her bag tighter. Passengers tensed, eyes darting between the two men. Andrew's stance didn't change, his calm demeanor masking the readiness in his body. "I'm not here to fight you," he said quietly, but the storm brewing in James's eyes hinted that this might no longer be a choice. The tension was unbearable. James lunged forward, his movements clumsy but filled with frustration and misplaced rage. The entire bus seemed to hold its breath as Andrew stepped back, just enough to avoid the sudden advance. "Calm down," Andrew said firmly, his voice steady but commanding. "This isn't the way to handle this." Emily's heart pounded as she watched, her father's unsteady steps and the tension in the air making it hard to breathe. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stop, but fear kept her frozen. James stumbled, his aggression faltering as he realized Andrew wasn't fighting back. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. Andrew didn't respond with words. Instead, he extended his hand slightly, his calm presence like a wall against the storm of emotions swirling around them. The bus driver stood now, his voice sharp. "I'm calling the cops if this doesn't stop." Passengers murmured nervously, some standing, others moving toward the front. That's when Emily did something she'd never done before. "Dad, please stop," she cried, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the chaos. James froze, turning to look at her. The vulnerability in her voice seemed to break something in him. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining from his body. But just as the moment seemed to settle, the unexpected twist came. A man near the front of the bus, who had been quietly observing, stood and spoke. "Emily, are you okay?" His voice was calm but held an air of authority. She turned, confused. How did he know her name? James stiffened, his face paling. Andrew glanced between them, his instincts sharpening again. Emily stared at the man who had spoken, her mind racing. His voice was unfamiliar, but there was something calm and steady about him, like he knew exactly what he was doing. "I've been looking for you," he said gently, his gaze shifting to James, who now looked more startled than angry. "Your behavior has been reported before, hasn't it? It's time we address this properly." James stumbled back a step, his face pale, his earlier bravado crumbling. "Who are you?" he demanded, but the man didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out a badge, revealing he was with Child Protective Services. "I'm here to make sure Emily is safe," he replied firmly. The bus was silent as everyone watched the scene unfold, the tension shifting into something heavier but more certain. Andrew stepped aside, letting the man take the lead. Emily's wide eyes filled with tears, a mix of relief and fear as she clutched her bag tightly. Am I leaving with you?" she whispered. The man knelt down to her level, his voice soft but confident. "You don't have to be scared anymore. We're here to help you, to make sure you're in a place where you feel safe and loved." James started to argue, but his words faltered under the weight of his guilt and the realization that this was no longer in his control. Emily turned to Andrew, who gave her a reassuring nod. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady. "This is the first step toward something better." As Emily was led off the bus, she looked back one last time. For the first time in years, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes. This wasn't the ending she'd imagined, but it was a chance for a new beginning, and she was ready to take it.